Serial murders are a dark chapter in human history that deeply shocks and fascinates society. These disturbing events, marked by a series of gruesome acts, have challenged the human imagination for centuries. Each case carries its own story, from innocent victims losing their lives to mysterious perpetrators who often remained undiscovered for long periods. These narratives offer insights into the deepest recesses of the human psyche, and serve as a reminder that evil often lurks in the darkest corners. The following stories provide an impactful glimpse into some of the most notorious and ominous serial murders that have ever shaken the world. Number 10. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H. Holmes, was one of the earliest known serial killers in the United States. His story is marked by cold-blooded murders and a highly developed system of deceit and manipulation. Holmes was an intelligent man and a skilled fraudster. He ran a pharmacy in Chicago and used his abilities to construct a huge building in the 1890s, now known as the Holmes Castle or the Murder Hotel. This building was a complex labyrinth of rooms, corridors, and secret passages designed by Holmes specifically for his criminal intentions. During the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, Holmes attracted numerous guests to his hotel, many of whom never emerged alive. He likely killed an unknown number of people in cruel ways, including women he hired as staff at his hotel or whom he met during the World's Fair. Holmes used his hotel to torture and murder his victims, then dispose of their bodies. It was believed that he transported the remains of his victims to various locations in the building, treated them chemically, and eventually sold or disposed of them. His schemes eventually came to an end when he was arrested for insurance fraud. Investigators later uncovered his heinous crimes and the true nature of the Murder Hotel. Holmes was ultimately convicted of multiple murders and executed in 1896. The story of H. Holmes continues to fascinate people due to the meticulous planning of his crimes, his ability to deceive his victims, and the eerie atmosphere of his hotel, which became the scene of countless tragedies. His actions have earned a notable place in the history of serial killers. Number 9. The Green River Killer, also known as Gary Ridgway, was one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history. His crimes, committed in the 1980s and 1990s in Washington state, caused horror and years of investigation. Ridgway began his killing spree in the early 1980s, targeting young women often involved in prostitution. He lured his victims to remote locations and brutally murdered them. Most of his murders occurred along the Green River, earning him his nickname. Although the exact number of his victims remained uncertain for a long time, Ridgway was arrested in 2001 based on DNA evidence and other clues. In a comprehensive deal with the prosecution, he eventually confessed to 49 murders, although there were likely more victims. It is believed he might be responsible for well over 70 murders. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison after pleading guilty and assisting authorities in finding the remains of some of his victims. Despite his imprisonment, investigations continue to determine the identities of some victims and potentially ascertain the exact number of his murders. The Green River Killer fascinated the public due to the large number of his victims, and the extensive investigations needed to finally convict him. His actions had a profound impact on crime fighting and the study of serial killers in the United States. Number 8. Ed Gein was a serial killer and grave robber who operated in Plainfield, Wisconsin, in the 1950s. His story and actions later served as inspiration for well-known horror films like Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. Jane grew up on a farm and had a problematic relationship with his domineering mother, whom he almost fanatically revered. After her death in 1945, Jane lost the primary reference point in his life and began increasingly indulging in morbid fantasies. He started stealing corpses from graveyards to fashion trophies and household items from them. Jane would cut body parts and use skin to make clothing and masks. His macabre actions remained undiscovered for a long time as he had managed to blend in as an unassuming member of the community. Jane's crimes came to light in 1957 when he was suspected of being involved in the disappearance of a local woman. During a search of his property, investigators found a macabre collection of body parts, masks made from human skin, and trophies from the bodies of his victims. Jane was arrested and confessed to 2 murders, although he claimed his trophies were from bodies he had dug up from cemeteries. Due to his mental issues, he was declared mentally incompetent and committed to a psychiatric facility. Although officially convicted of only 2 murders, Jane's case became a symbol of evil and disturbance in American culture. His actions and the cruelty of his deeds have earned a lasting place in the annals of criminal history. Number 7. The BTK Killer, also known as Dennis Rader, was a serial killer who operated in Kansas between 1974 and 1991. BTK stood for bind, torture, kill, a description of his cruel methods. Rader was a married man who seemingly lived a normal life. He worked as a security officer and was active in his community. It was during this time that he began his series of murders. His first known crime occurred in 1974 when he brutally murdered an entire family, 4 members, in their home. Rader meticulously planned the murders and followed a cruel pattern of binding, torturing, and killing his victims. He later confessed to additional murders, totaling 10 between 1974 and 1991. During the years between his crimes, Rader sent letters to the media and the police, divulging details about his actions and identifying himself as the BTK Killer. He taunted investigators and instilled fear in the community. Investigations into the case stalled, and Rader's identity remained unknown. It was a cat-and-mouse game between him and the authorities until he was tracked down through DNA evidence and communication traces, and arrested in 2005. In court, Rader confessed to the murders and described gruesome details of how he tortured and killed his victims. He was ultimately sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole. The BTK murders shook the community in Kansas and left a dark mark on the criminal history of the USA. Number 6. The Zodiac Killer is one of the most notorious unidentified serial killers in U.S. history. His crimes occurred in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Northern California. The killer adopted the name Zodiac in a series of encrypted letters sent to newspapers and the police. These letters contained coded messages that remain incompletely deciphered to this day. In some of the letters, the Zodiac claimed that the messages would help reveal his identity. The Zodiac Killer is associated with at least 5 confirmed murders, although he claimed to have committed many more. His first victims were a young couple killed in 1968 in a park in Vallejo, California. Several months later, 2 more people were killed at a drive-in movie theater. Most of his victims were young couples attacked at night in remote locations. The Zodiac Killer continued his murders and assaults, instigating fear and terror while engaging the police in a cat-and-mouse game. Despite several suspects, the Zodiac Killer was never apprehended. His identity remains a mystery to this day. Numerous investigations, DNA tests, and attempts to decipher the encrypted messages have yet to identify the culprit. The cryptic letters and the lack of clear leads have made the Zodiac Killer a fascinating and unsettling chapter in criminal history, with his story and identity remaining unsolved. Number 5. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, was a notorious serial killer and rapist active in late 1980s California. Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. His crime spree began in 1984 and lasted until 1985. He broke into the homes of his victims at night, raping, murdering, and committing numerous other gruesome acts. He terrorized people in Southern California, leaving a bloody trail of at least 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and numerous burglaries. The brutality of his crimes and the random selection of victims caused unprecedented fear among the population. Ramirez also gained attention for his appearance. He had a striking look with wild, long black hair and an eerie demeanor. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker due to his nocturnal assaults. He was arrested in August 1985 after being recognized and held by a vigilant group of citizens until the police arrived. During his trial, which began in 1989, Ramirez showed no remorse and seemed to enjoy the media's interest in him. He was eventually convicted of 13 counts of murder, rape, burglary, and other crimes, receiving the death penalty. Ramirez spent many years on death row before dying of liver cancer in 2013, before the sentence could be carried out. The crimes of Richard Ramirez remain a dark chapter in U.S. criminal history and have left deep marks in the collective memory of the population. Number 4. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, was a U.S. serial killer who operated between 1972 and 1978 in Chicago, Illinois. Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago and was known as a successful contractor and an active community member. He participated in numerous social and political activities, including children's entertainment as Pogo the Clown, at birthday parties and events. Behind the facade of a socially engaged man was a dangerous serial killer. Gacy lured young men to his home, where he strangled or suffocated them. He then sexually assaulted the bodies and buried most of them on his property. In 1978, Gacy was finally arrested after the police investigated the disappearance of a 15-year-old boy. During a search of his house, investigators discovered the remains of several young men buried on the premises. In total, the remains of 33 men were found. Gacy was convicted of 33 counts of murder and sentenced to death in 1980. During his time on death row, he showed no remorse for his actions. His story shook the nation and led to intense discussions about the psychological profiles of serial killers and the need to enhance monitoring and screening of individuals who have access to youths and young adults. Gacy's case and his crimes also significantly influenced the image of the harmless clown in popular culture. Number 3. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, was a serial killer and sex offender active in the 1980s in the USA. Born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dahmer was perceived as a quiet but isolated child. In his youth, he displayed an interest in dissecting animals and later developed an obsession with dead animals and their dismemberment. His criminal career began in the 1980s when he started murdering and mutilating young men. His murders involved sexual assaults, torture, and cannibalistic acts. Most of his victims were young men he met at bars or on the streets. Dmer was first arrested in 1988 after a victim escaped and was brought to the police. A search of his house revealed disturbing evidence of his crimes, including body parts and photos of mutilated bodies. During his incarceration, Dmer confessed to 17 murders in the United States and during his time in Germany, where he was stationed during his military service. He was convicted of 15 murders in Wisconsin and received a life sentence in 1992. In 1994, Dmer was murdered in prison by another inmate. His crimes and heinous acts shocked the public and led to discussions about the psyche of serial killers, and the necessity to improve mental health and law enforcement. Number 2. Ted Bundy was one of the most infamous serial killers in U.S. history. He was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. Bundy seemingly grew up in a normal family and was perceived as an intelligent and charming young man. In the 1970s, Bundy began a cruel series of crimes. He abducted, raped, and murdered young women in several states. Bundy used his charm to deceive his victims and take them captive. His specific victim profile often targeted young, attractive women, and he employed various methods to ensnare them. Bundy's arrest occurred only in 1975, after being apprehended in Utah for a traffic offense. Despite initial suspicions, he managed to escape prison twice. During his time on the run, he committed further murders. He was eventually captured again and stood trial. Representing himself, Bundy used his intelligence to manipulate the court. He attempted to delay the proceedings and claim innocence, but overwhelming evidence was against him. Bundy was ultimately convicted of a series of murders and was executed in the 1980s. His actions and personality contributed to him becoming a sad icon of serial killers. Bundy remains the subject of investigations and debates about the psyche and motivations of serial killers. Number 1. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who was active in Victorian London in the late 19th century. His name originated from an anonymous letter sent to the police, signed as I Jack the Ripper. The murders attributed to Jack the Ripper mostly occurred in 1888 in London's East End. His victims were primarily women working as prostitutes. The exact number of murders attributed to him is uncertain, but it is believed that he brutally killed at least 5 women. Most of these women were killed in similar ways, their bodies mutilated, and their throats cut. The brutality and cruelty of the murders caused fear and terror in Victorian London. At that time, the police were unable to apprehend the perpetrator, and many theories and speculations surrounded Jack the Ripper's identity. Despite numerous suspicions and investigations, the real identity of Jack the Ripper was never definitively determined. Various individuals have been considered possible suspects over the years, but to this day, there is no definitive solution to the mystery of his identity. The case of Jack the Ripper remains one of the most notorious and enigmatic crimes in criminal history. Examining these cases of serial murders reveals the darkest facets of human nature. It's a grim chapter that reminds us that evil can sometimes be hard to recognize. These stories should not only serve as horrors but also as a reminder to remain vigilant and recognize the signs that could lead to such tragic events. Their unsolved mysteries and the devastating impact on the victims and their families persist, serving as a reminder that our world isn't always as safe as it may seem. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to not miss out on future videos. Leave your feedback and suggestions for future video topics in the comments below. Until next time, thank you for your support.